Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome back to day 2 of the API Summit and Expo for 2017. It's great to have you all back. I understand some of you might have survived dinner last night and, of course, the traffic coming back into Sandton. So we appreciate you giving up your time once more to join us for invigorating conversations regarding the property investment landscape across the African continent. For a quick overview on some of the themes we discussed yesterday, we certainly got to understand the dynamics of the African continent and that nothing is set in stone. Whilst we all endeavor to have long-term strategies, you certainly need to be quite nimble and agile in order to adapt to the ever-changing environment. Lots more optimism coming through from the East. The West as well still holds lots of opportunities given the fundamentals that have been presented. But of course, North is also where we need to look and establish, especially with markets such as more francophone entities and countries presenting themselves as investment opportunities which are ripe for us to tap into. We continue to look at some of these themes regarding skills as well, the necessary development and adequate skills retention and allocation in order to ensure that we meet the needs of investors like yourselves here in the room. Regardless of the fact that there might be an oversupply in some markets, it certainly means that we need to be more cautious about how we meet local demand and ensure that local partnerships form the basis of our investment decisions. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, we look to build up on some of these conversations and themes that we have been had yesterday and building up on them today. And we also look to do this by having you engage more with us on social media platforms. Please feel free to log on to the Wi-Fi network that we have, API Summit and Expo. The password is property with a capital P. Property with a capital P, and if you are posting anything on social media, which we strongly encourage you to do, please use the hashtag API 2017, API 2017. Many of you have already taken your seats and ready to take down your notes. You might have noticed that we also have a wonderful magazine with you on the table there, our Africa Property Skyline magazine. Please feel free to have a look with regard to the latest developments and projects, and even some of our award winners from the API Awards, which were launched just yesterday. There's more information on their developments, the partners that they got involved with, and of course, future ambitions that they hope to achieve going forward. That's the African Property Skyline magazine. It is the 2nd edition, so feel free to go through it today. It is hot off the press for your consumption. To give you a synopsis of today's program and running order, ladies and gentlemen, we do have 2 sub-conferences that we'll focus on. Yesterday, you might have acknowledged that we had 3 breakaway rooms where more intimate and more engaging conversations took place with regard to particular topics, and we look to continue that theme today. Firstly, in the room 3, which will be the blue room, and we strongly encourage you as well to look through your agenda and program that you have with you in your delegate bag and behind your name tag to ensure that, again, you don't follow the herd, but rather engage in conversations which are meaningful to you and the operations that you look to involve yourself in. We'll look at Future Cities Africa, which is a sub-conference based on urban development. And like yesterday, we heard themes regarding urbanization and growing population trends, which have constantly been re-emphasized. This is what we look to unpack in understanding the planning, infrastructure, and urban development requirements needed in order to develop new African cities that are future fit and, of course, allow us to grow and amend our portfolios as necessary. So these are some of the conversations that will be taking place in our Future Cities Africa sub-conference, and there'll be separate conversations as well under this specific division. In room 2, we'll have our Retail Innovation Summit. This naturally takes a look at the robust investment that's been taking place within the retail sector across many markets in the African continent. We'll take a look at themes that have been raised, such as oversupply, also getting in the right partners, the infrastructural development that's required, and of course, getting some of the right retailers in to meet the local demand. How do we address some of those concerns which have constantly been raised as an area of contention? Innovation is also something that will be unpacked within that particular stream too. So please do allocate yourself to the necessary sub-conferences, and feel free as well, if you'd like to engage in both streams, go ahead and do so. And of course, we strongly allow and encourage you to participate and network, not only in those conversations, but of course amongst yourselves in our networking lounge. Well, now that we've got the excitement going and we understand the program for today and hope that you will strongly engage in what it is that we're trying to achieve, we move on to our next conversation, our first presentation for the day, which takes a look at building Africa's housing and housing finance market in the continent. We do know that there's a significant dearth here. We'll start off with a presentation which gives us an overview and understanding of the market dynamics, and then engage in a panel discussion where leaders will also talk to us about the varying aspects of how we need to address this issue regarding both affordability and accessibility to housing across the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, help me warmly welcome on stage, first to give us a presentation and the moderator of the panel discussion, Kesia Rust, who's the Executive Director at the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, based in South Africa, followed by panelists who will be engaging in conversation with her, Peter Maila, Senior Investment Principal at CDC Group, Kenan Lakmiharan, who's from McKinsey Group International, David Lupepe, Mota Engel, based in South Africa, and Bolan Lawal, Honorable Commissioner for Housing in Lagos State, that's in the Lagos State Government of Nigeria. Ladies and gentlemen, please warmly welcome our moderator and panelists on stage. Thanks. You can go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. So nice to be here. I understand that yesterday was an excellent day with very good deliberations. I was following them on social media. I'm very excited about what we're talking about today because I think within the overall landscape of property investment, residential is often overlooked. And in fact, when we do look at residential, our focus is rather narrow, given what I would argue and what I hope my panelists will also argue this morning is the scope of opportunity. I have a presentation. I wonder if the slides can be put up, please. Must I press something? There we go. Excellent. So there is a presentation later today. I think it was in the blue stream. Where the World Bank, Somiklal, is presenting on a report that they've just put out about Africa's cities opening doors to the world. And what's fascinating about this report is it talks about the role of cities in promoting economic growth, a critical issue within the continent. And when we think about Africa's cities, we have all sorts of different images in our mind. This is a photograph taken from my hotel room in Dar es Salaam, a rather pastel city. Much of the housing within downtown Dar es Salaam has been built and is owned and managed by the National Housing Corporation, which offers that housing for rental. And a lot of that is looking pretty derelict. We're in inner city Dar es Salaam, and we have a country that is growing quite rapidly, and we can see a lot of investment interest in the country. But the housing situation is not looking so beautiful. When we start to then think about, and this is what the report goes into, and I won't go into detail at all, but what struck me is a quite significant level of underinvestment. They estimate 9 years lag in investment in the infrastructure and in housing, specifically, housing investment specifically within the cities. And the impact of good housing on the capacity of a city to actually produce and to realize the growth objectives that we have for it is something that's articulated quite strongly in that report. But of course, within that, we know that housing is expensive, and as a result that you even have middle-income earners who are living rough, who are living in housing situations which are inadequate. They're either overcrowded or poorly maintained. You have informal housing situations which in fact are more expensive on the whole, but on a day-to-day basis are much cheaper. And so the efficiency of a housing market and how that contributes to the capacity of a labor market to then contribute and build the economic growth potential of cities across the continent is undermined. And within that, a recognition of the role that housing then plays across all of our goals for city development. So what does this residential investment opportunity look like? We can dance to that one. Look over at this one. And oftentimes I think what happens is when we take a look at the picture, we look at the ones at the top and we think, well, a significant proportion of Africa is rural. But we also know and are becoming increasingly aware that urbanization rates are significant. And right now, you have an urbanization rate, for example, in Kampala of 5.6%. That's enormous. That's a lot of people moving into the city and requiring housing. Then we think, well, the poor, the mass of population that are unable to afford a house that we would want to develop, well, they must be covered by government. And certain countries are actually doing this. So that's a development at the top right there in Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian government is putting a lot of money into developing housing for lower income earners. The South African government as well has put an enormous amount of money into developing housing for low income earners. There are not many governments that are actually able to do that and to make that kind of investment. And then we think, well, slums are certainly not a target market in this because people living in slums, certainly if they're living in that situation, then they don't have an income that can contribute. But we also know that within that context, people who are living in slums are actually, many of them are employed and are earning incomes, but there isn't a housing target to which to apply their income. And then, of course, we also know that across the continent, the major way that people access their housing is through self-build. And they build it themselves, they buy a plot of land, and then incrementally over time, with savings or whatever, they will build their house, and they will build it to quite a beautiful standard. And we have this constraint on scale. And it may have been fine for decades and decades to approach housing across the continent in this way. But with the levels of urbanization rates we have, that one by one process is insufficient, and we're going to have increasingly derelict conditions in our cities, and that's going to impact on our ability as a continent to grow even beyond our housing aspirations into our economic growth aspirations. So then we think, I Googled, what does real estate look like in Africa? So I looked for images of real estate, and we get these beautiful glass, shiny, fancy structures, and there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. That disconnect then is expressed in the opportunities that we approach and that we see. So Vision City is a 500-unit development that's in Kigali, Rwanda. It was paid for by the pension fund and developed, so that's household savings that have gone into the pension fund and that's investing in this development. A 2-bedroom apartment went for about $178,000. This 5-bedroom villa was $560,000. And as a result, there was an announcement in All Africa in the press earlier that the development had to slash prices, so that there wasn't the kind of take-up that was expected. In fact, many of the units, the large units like this, they were bought with cash. And that's also not contributing to the kind of movement that we want in an economy that's a completely different target market and very narrow. So there's a disconnect there of what the Rwandan pension fund was expecting would be the demand in a city like Kigali, and what the demand would actually be. Another example that we've heard about is Kalamba, and that's the development of about 22,000 units, 30 kilometers outside of Luanda in Angola. And in that one, that was deemed or defined by the government as an affordable housing development, was part of the government's national plan. And the entry-level housing within that was about $120,000 a unit. And as it was funded with anticipated oil revenue, and as that oil revenue decreased because of the commodities and the oil downturn, it meant that the government actually had to pay more money into that. And for a long time, that was touted in the press as a ghost town. There is take-up that's happening now, but given the kind of demand that we would expect on the continent, are these the developments that are appropriate? So we have on our website, we have a calculator where we took mortgage rates that are advertised by lenders across the continent and then looked at the income distribution in each country and tried to assess. We built a calculator that says if you buy a house of a certain amount, what would be the monthly repayment for that house from one country to the next? And I can't even see the numbers from here, so I can't read them out to you. But green is where you've got a pretty good proportion of the population who are able to afford that, the urban population, and red is where it's not looking so good. I've done this calculation on a $10,000 house. So think about that. In Kenya, the pie graph there is Kenya, and about 20% of the urban population would be able to afford a $10,000 house. Can we begin to imagine that as an option, a $10,000 house? So we know that housing has a significant impact on the economy. If we were to build this $10,000 house in Nigeria, that would be about 2.4 million naira, more or less. And we can see that there's a macroeconomic environment that feeds into the dynamics that would shape the land and infrastructure, the construction, the building materials, the labor market, and the professional services to build that house in the middle. And that is an overall policy environment that impacts on our ability to deliver that $10,000 house. But that then influences a whole lot of demand for other things, for furniture and appliances, for home improvement, for the finance for that, the building materials, transit, infrastructure, retail property, all of the kinds of things that we want to support, just by starting to deliver a house that is meeting a significant proportion of the demand in a city. And that, of course, then contributes to GDP and job creation. And is that not something we'd want to support? So in Nigeria, the Fuller Foundation is delivering a $10,000 house. If I say that to you, I can almost see some of your body language. You shake, you shrug your shoulders a bit, you roll your eyes. $10,000 house, that's sort of beyond what is reasonable. It sounds like it's something that's extra on the side. It's probably something an NGO does. It is something an NGO does. And that's not really where the market is. How can we turn that into something that actually is realistic, that's something that becomes the baseline of what we deliver? Because in fact, it's starting to address what the population looks like. So what Fuller has done is they've developed a unit that can be improved incrementally over time. So it starts with a very small unit, and then you can improve it over time, and and the plan is designed from the beginning to enable that. And you can imagine the impact that that would have on demand for all of those additional services that were on the right-hand side of my earlier graph. If we can start to make a $10,000 house sound like a real thing, and not just something that other people in NGOs and nonprofits do, I think that's when we start to crack the opportunity and start to leverage, in fact, the breadth of the demand side that we can see. So one of the problems, of course, for investors is that it has a lot to do with scale. Investors want to make one big investment in something that they know is going to work. They don't want to have to watch it every 3 minutes to make sure that it's going to turn over properly. So they're looking for large scale. So we need to think about aggregation opportunities. We've done some research recently into REITs and the way in which REITs can aggregate a whole range of housing development opportunities to make them accessible to a set of investors, while also aggregating the investors down into those housing opportunities. We're also doing some research at the moment around SACCOs, and SACCOs are fascinating. In Kenya, the World Bank just published a report where they argue that, or they found that only 10% of housing, of all housing credit is coming through the banks as mortgages, but the remaining 90% or so of housing credit is actually being delivered by SACCOs and co-ops. Now, how do we actually harness that and think about that in relation to that $10,000 house? And then lastly, rental also offers a really interesting opportunity about bringing the demand side on stream and helping build a credit record over time if you're thinking about a rent-to-buy model, or aggregating the management process. And I think those are some interesting niches. Within rental, we've been looking at employer housing as well as student housing. And those are all issues that I think bear further consideration and may offer us some lessons for looking forward in terms of how to access and realistically engage with that $10,000 target I would like to set for discussion this morning, within the bounds of what we each can do in terms of our own business models. So I think that's where I'll stop. The REITs research we launched in Kigali about 3 months ago, and that's available on our website. And we looked at the application of REITs for affordable housing specifically. The big issue that was found there was trust. Is this actually going to work? And investors wondering if it was even realistic. And then also scale. Can we deliver to a scale that a REIT would be able to fund? Our work on SACCOs will be published soon, and our work on rental as well. So let me stop there, and then I think we can have a very good conversation. Thank you very much. It's on already. There we go. Hello. Okay. So I've sent our panelists a number of questions. I'm very open for the conversation to carry on beyond those. But let's just start by a first one. All of you are involved in housing and the affordable sector across the continent. And given that, what are the investment opportunities that you've identified specifically? What are the things that seem real to you now? I'll start with you.
Good morning. But Keisha, you forgot to send us the answers.
Yes.
I mean, in terms of the affordable housing market, from CDC point of view, it is a market that we are highly interested in. And just before talking about it, how we look at investing or deploying capital, we've got 3 ways from CDC. The first part is through intermediate equity. That's where we play a role as an LP. We provide capital to real estate funds. We have done this to several of them, from Actis, Fatisa Home, ACA, and the rest. And the second part is through debt, where we provide, it could be ranging from construction finance debt up to development debt. And the third part is equity, where we do invest in project equity. So we've invested with Tata Value Homes in India, that they are developing low-cost housing. We have invested in mixed use in Garden City, Nairobi. We have invested also in Africa Logistic Properties. So those are the 3 pillars. And to mention the investment amounts, the minimum we'll look at it is around $10 to $20 million, and we can do up to $100 million. You know, if you go to a real estate agent and they ask you, how much do you want to, what is your budget for the house? You say between 20 and 100. They hear 100. So let me go to the 100 then. On the 100 part, we will look at it if it's a platform. And I'll come later to explain how we view platform. Platform typically we view multiple site, multiple geography to diversify the risk. It's not going to be in one project for obvious reasons, diversification. Then you asked how the strategy from our side. So as I mentioned, that the 3 businesses that we have, we could either go through the fund, we provide capital to a GP, and a GP provide capital into the projects. But let me speak directly where we are directly investing. So we have looked at the market in terms of the affordable, and what we noticed is that doing in terms of the projects that we have seen, the pipeline is typically 50, max 100 units at a time by the developer. Project costs on a low-cost housing, $5 to $10 million. Amount required from CDC, $3 to $4 million. You could see the check sizes become smaller for us. So that is the first issue. And the second part, what we have decided, we said, can we be able to look at it in terms of a platform? For me, I don't believe in the big part of saying deliver 2,000, 5,000 units at one go into the market. You take the largest mortgage numbers, either Nairobi, outside of South Africa, either Nairobi or Nigeria, they are hovering around plus or minus 20,000. So delivering 10% of the current mortgage market at once, it's a lot. So what we have now looked at the models is that, can we be able to invest in a platform where We provide capital and to an investor who will be able to look in terms of the rental model. Because we have the pains that we went through of unpacking the mortgage, construction costs, and all other issues, all of us, we know them. I don't want to labor on it. But it's more, today I want to look at it in terms of what are the solutions we can work on to deliver affordable housing. So that is the first part, to say, can we be able to look at it as an off-taker? We will still continue working with what I call the Bucky builders. Bucky builders is a name in South Africa, but outside where we look at it, it's more of the small local developers, because they are the ones, I believe, they can deliver a $10,000 house. Because immediately you bring large construction developers, they bring a crane, and. To rent a crane a day is $10,000. You can imagine by the time they finish the cost, the house, you have to price it at 100, 200,000. Then you have the problem that you had in Kigali in terms of selling price, and a lot of those projects. So that is the first one. We looked at it. You still could be able to reduce the cost, but you improve the quality. The issue throughout in affordable housing is the off-taker. You don't have a strong off-taker. Congratulations if you could get the government, or if you can get a mining house that could say, you know what, this is for my employees, I'll take 1,000 or 2,000, great. Or if you can have an insurance company, local insurance said, I will take the whole stock. But we haven't seen it that much happening. So it's either you as the investor, you take that as a rental pool. Similar model where IHS they've done. Here in South Africa and other parts of the world, we've seen it. It's where we are looking to explore, can it work or won't be able to work? So that's where our thoughts are now, and we're investing a lot of time in terms of the affordable housing market.
David, how does that suit in terms of your understanding, and can that $10,000 house be built?
Well,
Tell us a little bit also about the work that you're doing.
Yes, so thanks, Kessia. So a bit of the work that I do is, I wear two hats, if you want to call it that. So as head of business development for Motor and Jewel Construction South Africa, which is, the South African office for a major global international construction company all around the world, and heavily invested in Africa as well, in about 13 different countries. My role has required me to, kind of step outside the traditional contractor mindset of, chasing contracts. And I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a few housing developments in the time that I've been in the construction industry. So on the development side of things, the role that I play is as a investor and developer of mega housing projects. And so what we do see is a disconnect in the market between the backlog that the government has identified to say, there's, over a 2 million unit backlog in South Africa alone. And when you look at that, the bulk of it is in the low income bracket. And yet you find most developers and contractors are kind of chasing the middle to, higher income developments. So I think there is an opportunity to kind of look at solutions in that market. But from an opportunity perspective, back to your original question, I want to look at it from a different angle, which is looking at it upstream to say, well, to unlock these affordable housing opportunities, I think there is a bigger challenge that has to be tackled in the form of your bulk infrastructure and your services. And well, I'm going to look at it from the angle of a developer. So, I've been involved in these, mega city housing projects that Gauteng has been bold enough to, take the step to look at. And I know that's a bit different from what we've just been discussing, which is your smaller cluster developments of 100 units, 200 units. So Gauteng Human Settlements has taken the view that, to address the backlog, they wanted to focus more on mega cities, which are, 10,000 units and more. And that would include several housing typologies. So not just your, $10,000 homes, but also your, social housing for people who want to rent, your gap housing, so people between your rental brackets and your affordable housing brackets. And there's about 20 of these projects that have been approved and budgeted for by Human Settlements National, and down to Human Settlements Gauteng, and they're slated for delivery over the next 5 to 10 years. So if you look at each project delivering at least 10,000 units, and there's about 20 of them, you're looking at about 200,000 homes slated for delivery over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, where it gets interesting is being privy to some of these roundtable discussions with other developers who are looking at these projects and human settlements themselves. We all identified the challenge of bulk infrastructure. So most of these developments are on, private land or, land that's agricultural, and they may be, in growth corridors where there has not been significant or adequate investment in your bulk infrastructure, so your sewer, your water, your electricity. And this is quite a significant issue because, as a developer, if you were to go ahead and you were to build all these units, you'd, have top structures and have no running water and have no electricity and nowhere to go. So I think from my perspective, there is kind of an opportunity for the investment sector to look at how they can kind of partner with government or some of these municipalities who I know may not have necessarily the best financial management track record, but the question there is, how do we solve that problem of actually getting investment to flow through these municipalities to get this bulk infrastructure so that we can, as developers, actually proceed with, building the top structures, with, providing the housing. And my particular take on it is, if you look at, for example, some of your pension funds, they have the long-term time horizon that matches the investment that will be required for this infrastructure and for, your housing, which is, typically 10 to 15 years. If you look at social housing, you'd have to hold the stock for at least 15 years until you can actually sell it. So considering that seemingly good match in time horizons, how much do pension funds currently allocate to housing infrastructure and housing, which is quite a big need for some of the people for a lot of people who are actually contributing to those funds. So I don't know, that's my take on it. I think the bulk infrastructure is actually an opportunity that a lot of people kind of overlook.
Okay, thank you very much. Kenan, McKinsey is known for systems. That's what you're good at. And this is a sector that requires an enormous amount of choreography. What are your thoughts around that? And also bearing in mind, we've got this relationship between the private sector and the public sector, came out quite strongly in David's comments as well, that that's an important factor. How would you approach that?
Thank you. I just want to also go back to what you said you asked a question, what is opportunity? Yeah. We did some work 2 years ago around what is the blueprint towards dealing with the global, affordable housing gap. We think the opportunity, for example, in Africa by 2025 is to deal with the 23 million unit backlog just in 3 countries, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, for example. Okay. South Africa, for example, will be about 4 million, Nigeria about 15. And the opportunity for investors and developers is about, we think, $350 billion in that period. And we also worked out, similar to what you've done, that if we can get the houses to about $10,000 to $15,000 a unit, we get in there. It's obviously based on a few things, but we'll get to it. And some of the levers to get it there, because you also asked, how do we get it there? 4 levers. One is, for sure, unlocking the land supply and getting that cost down. And there's ways to do that around land registers, around cross-subsidies, around, getting land back, putting infrastructure in, giving a smaller portion back to the original land users, and then build in social, housing on that. And we have examples, I'll come back to that in the private sector. That's the first lever. The second lever, kind of thinking about industrial construction of housing units and modular units, and there's examples of that, especially in China. Third is definitely private-public partnerships. And then probably the fourth is, how do you reduce financing costs? And there are probably 4 levers there we'll get into if we have time for the detail. And our report gets into a bit more detail around that blueprint. So that's the kind of how do you do it. And then what is the role of the private sector? And I'll give you an anecdote. I think in South Africa, when we did some research around some of the opportunities, the niche markets, I think you also asked, affordable housing for middle to low income, student housing, because of our youth population growing. We think in South Africa, for example, we need to spend about 100 billion rand at least over the next 10 years. The current model will put that burden on government. A combination of some of these levers and shifting the load to private sector in a certain way could reduce that to 20 to 40%. The burden could be reduced down to 20 to 40% on government. How do we do that? So I think when you look at private-public partnerships, there's some case examples. One of the ones that we like referring to is in Turkey, where we see and this is done at a national level, where government essentially looked at all the land and then in a coordinated fashion, partnered with the private sector to, and essentially is developing about 10% of the land and for affordable housing, and probably has provided about 50% of the affordable housing. Ahmedabad in India, which is done at a city level, are redeveloping 3% of their land every year. And what they do is they negotiate with the land users, buy back, in a sense, take the land, provide infrastructure, give a smaller portion back, and the original land users are happier because their value of land has gone up. And then the remaining portion of the land is used for affordable housing, the infrastructure that's needed to help everyone, and then other commercial development, which also provides other revenue. So they're doing it in a very systematic way, and they've got 5 phases that they're going through. So there's different models to do this. So those are just some examples. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Burhan, you're sitting in the hot seat. And on so many levels as a representative of your government. But in addition, in Nigeria, with a backlog of 17 million units estimated, and significant of that would be in Lagos State. And yet, so much of what we've been discussing has been about good and efficient systems. I think that's the point that Kanan has just made, is that if those systems on which we rely from government are efficient, in fact, things can work much more smoothly. What is the Lagos State government doing in that regard, and who are you working with?
Thank you very much. Good morning, all. This is a very good opportunity for Lagos and for me as the commissioner in charge of housing to pitch the initiatives of the administration of Lagos State Governor. So far, Lagos population is 23 million, estimated to be 23 million. That's a sizable number. The national population is 170 million. So in that population, there are loads of infrastructural challenges where housing is the major for me. And the deficit that we have in housing today in Lagos is about 3 million, 2,500,000 housing units. So how do we reduce that housing deficit? Can only government do that? definitely no. And we also did a research and confirmed that if we need to bridge that gap, we will have to be constructing 187,500 housing units yearly in the next 5 years. So those are challenges, and at the same time, there are opportunities there. For our collaboration with the private sector, what government is doing is making land available for development. Our land is our equity in the partnership. And if you also have to all gear towards reducing the cost of 1 unit of house. So for now, we have a program, Lagos Affordable Public Housing, and we're partnering with, we have 10 partners already, local and international, and the target is to develop 20,000 housing units in the next 5 years. Some of our developers are already on site. Government contribution is land. In some instances, percentage is about 12 to 15%, and the deal is whatever you produce, 15% of that will go into social housing, what we call rent to own. That is what we presently do. And if you look at the challenges, going to the opportunities that you mentioned in your first question, we see opportunities on the supply side of housing. There's no way we can construct 187,000 housing units in the conventional way that we practice, brick and mortar. No, we have to go into manufacturing of homes. So we will need technology. We will need technical partners that can do thousands of housing units. And government, as a matter of urgency, is opening up a lot of rural areas with different structural provisions so that you will not have to spend money in the provision of roads, in the provision of electrification, or in some cases, central sewage. So that is what the government has done. But on the demand side, it's also very challenging. In Nigeria, 58% of our economy is driven by the informal sector. Government, we must look at the opportunities for the informal sector people. You know, we have to come to how do we even grade the mortgage system. You know, it's very important because what mortgage has always been taking care of people in paid employment. What about the informal sector? And it's not limited to Nigeria. I mean, almost the entire sub-Saharan Africa. Almost 70% of the workforce are in the informal sector. So what are the initiatives that can bring in a lot of informal sector workers into home ownership ladder? That is the challenge I see here, and I also see opportunities for lots of us in this all.
It's interesting to hear you talk about a 20,000 unit commitment that the Lagos state government is making within the context of an annual demand of about 100,000 units, which means you need partners. And through the force of your development for those 20,000 units, you need everybody else to come and build more next to you. So my question, in fact, back to Peter is that a viable proposition for you? The activity that would happen in Lagos through the development that the government is championing, does that open up opportunities for you to continue to invest like next door?
First and foremost, to the Commissioner, I think to compliment you on unlocking land, because most of the issues that we have been facing is land. And when I was talking about land, it's not more in terms of is land availability within the proximity of the cities or infrastructure. People still need get to home to work and schools. And secondly is in terms of perfecting the title deeds. At times you find that land is available, it's in a private land, hence it is currently a farm to convert that into commercial use to go through that process in certain places can take you 3 to 5 years. And that is the key issue, unlocking that. So that is first to compliment the commissioner on that. And when you talk about now looking in terms of the delivery, of course, the numbers are there. I'm not sitting here doubting the numbers, I'm not worried on the demand side. For me, what I have noticed, especially new home buyers, immediately you want to sell them houses, especially migrant workers. And when I talk about migrant workers, it's not only for the low to middle income. Even a migrant worker working in New York, coming from Hong Kong or around the world, he is unlikely to buy in New York. He's likely to rent. And you ask them why, he'd rather buy back home, even though he will never set foot back home for another 40 years or 50 years. And it's the same mentality typically of migrant workers when they move first time to the city. The first thing, you find that they are still building back home houses, massive house than where he live in a slum. So to be able to move that mindset of buy, they rather rent. Currently they are renting. And you find that when you look at the amount of rent they are paying, at times could be even higher than the amount they will be paying by mortgage. So for me, I go back to say, you know, at times, we come to the models of saying, we'll have to build these houses in this format, people have to buy mortgage costs, and you're gonna create more problems than you could be able to solve. Therefore said, you're used to renting, therefore continue renting at this, whether rent to own or rent to buy. And I like to come back to this model. 3 weeks ago, I was in Angola, where you mentioned about the housing stock. The number of houses that in Angola, the Cora company that I met with, they have 3 models. Either you outright purchase, rent only, and rent to buy. The last 2 successful model. The first one, outright purchase. When I asked why are they not being people buying these units, when I spoke with the people, majority of them, they said, why should I buy in Luanda or Huambo? This is not my home. My home is in Kwanza Sol. I'm not gonna buy here. This is not my home. This is not my state. I don't belong here. So the people, they prefer to rent, even though some of them, they can be able to afford that unit. Also, they look at the cost and all other issues. So the mindset to be able to move people, to force them to always to say the off-taker must be 100% purchase, it becomes a little bit harder. And the other model that I've noticed, even here in South Africa, you track IHS. IHS, initially, they used to do outright sale. The financial crisis came, and therefore they moved to rental, and they became even more successful. They're building more units than before, because they noticed that people, when they come to Johannesburg, as you mentioned the units, people are more preferred to rent than actually to own. So I compliment you in terms of that we'll look at it. I said also look at it in terms of rent-to-own model, inviting the pension funds, the local pension funds, to be able to be an off-taker. And I'm mentioning the local pension funds intentionally, because as a foreigner coming to put $1 in, and then you get your money back in local currency over the next 20 years, the returns that you'll show to your investors is going to be very low. So it is much better in a model where an investor comes in, provide for the construction finance, a local partner with local currency buys all the units, keep them in local currency, and rent them out in local currency. You don't have a mismatch of FX. So that's, for me, the solution I keep on coming, so to look at it, all the parties, also the local pension funds, to be involved in that. David mentioned that they have the long-term capital, and they are looking for these instruments.
I want to open up the questions to the floor. As you think about your questions, one question just for Kanan. As we shift to a rental model, and I'm seeing that too, lots of developers and governments are increasingly interested. Shelter Afrique also has expressed interest specifically in rental, but it is a bit of an unknown, and there hasn't been that much experience in rental, so that will necessarily require different financing systems. Peter's talked about some of those. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that, while all of you, please, if you could think, we can take about 2 questions from the floor.
Sure. You know, I think the rent-to-own model is probably right, and there are other examples in other industries that we could although at a smaller scale, right? I think there's a few things. One is if you look at what the telcos are doing and what we're doing with solar home systems, where based on local knowledge and community knowledge, they're prepared to take more risk with certain communities and not, raise the rates, think about equity in a different way. They're able to kind of over time say, okay, we'll give you the solar home system, 6 to 7 years, it could be up to 15, and have some kind of system, a pay-as-you-go system or rental system. I'm saying there's some ways of thinking about equity in a different way, thinking of credit rating in a different way to deal with the informal settlement. And there are other models in Africa already which we could learn from. I don't think we've seen a scale, but that's one example, for example, just to get the debate going.
Any questions from the floor? Yes, sir. Please, if you could just identify yourself before. Thank you.
My name is Barry Cohen. I'm with 21st Century Communities. I'm affordable housing developer in the United States. When you mention the cost of $10,000 per home, how do you factor in the cost for the infrastructure, utilities, and various things like that? Does the government agency pay for it or help with the cost on that?
So thanks for your question. I think I mentioned earlier that that cost of 10,000, in my view, at least in the South African market, is quite impractical. At the moment, you're looking at for your lowest income segment. If you're looking at building housing for that segment, the government offers, through the Department of Human Settlements, offers a subsidy of 110,000 per home, and that's just for the top structure. You then have an allocation for, 110,000 rand. You've then got 43,000 rand allocated for your services, so that's your bulk infrastructure, your internal reticulation, all of that. And then you have 6,000 rands allocated for land. So if you add up all of that, you come to about 160,000 rand, which already puts you at 12,000 US dollars. Now you have got plenty of small contractors, the bucky builders that Peter mentioned, who still struggle at that quantum. So I think there needs to be a more honest conversation around what it actually costs to invest in bulk infrastructure and to acquire land. And the conversations that I've had as a developer with the municipalities, with the government, has been the level of contribution that the developer needs to actually put in, and that's a very hot topic when you're actually looking at doing a development, because as a developer, if I put in services, for example, your sewer, your water, your electricity, I do not derive any income or revenue from that going forward. The municipality does. However, there is a percentage contribution that I'm required to actually put in for that infrastructure, for which I won't necessarily get a return, and the municipality will get a return. So it's actually quite a hot topic. In my view, I think the powers that be should be doing more to actually look at how they can, manage the systems around investing in that infrastructure, and then actually being able to get the returns in terms of, the revenue collecting from the communities and managing that.
It is an interesting challenge, particular to South Africa, because of the way in which, in this case, the way in which the South African government pays for housing for a large segment of the population, which is a good lesson for Nigeria to take note of, because it does challenge the potential for investment from the outside. I would argue that in South Africa we have a case within the subsidized market where the government is crowding out investment by the private sector. Do we have time for one more question? Is there one more question? There's one in the back there.
Yes, if you look at what you've said now, if you go into a rural community and you start building, or not in a rural community, any community, and you start building houses, a portion of that community might be unhappy because you're not building their houses. How do you mitigate that problem? Would it not be a solution to involve the potential or the future owner of that house on a more practical basis to be involved in the actual construction? And then alternative building methods. What alternative building methods are you looking at? And won't that be a method to involve the future owner on a low skill basis to be involved, and then preventing other problems that might go with the situation?
Commissioner, could you perhaps answer that in terms of what you're planning in Lagos?
Yeah, thank you very much. What government is doing is to open up loads of rural areas with the provision of infrastructure, especially roads. And we also make sure that movement from those settlements, quote and unquote now, is usually made simple for the residents, because we have buses, we also have a blue line for railway service that will be able to move people from rural areas to the city. So we do that. Then on the method of construction, a lot of people have, like a couple of guys came in from the United States and even in South Africa here with prefab technology. With prefab technology, you can do so much, and you gain from the economies of scale, because we make sure that you have more numbers, and whatever you need from government in terms of infrastructure. But infrastructure is only limited to the main artery of the road, but not within the estate. So that is what we do now. And so far, we have been able to reduce the cost of one unit, a two-bedroom, 64 square meter, to less than $10,000. To be precise, 3.7 million naira. That's what we agreed on. And the incentives are there. We make sure that the construction, the permit, all the permits that you may require, we let you have order, because we have our skin in the game. We are also partners. Then to answer what Peter, on the certificate of occupancy, Lagos has migrated to e-fiscal planning permit, e-CFO, that's electronic CFO. So within 40 days, you are guaranteed your certificate of occupancy. That is your title. So we are really moving fast to ensure that title is being issued quickly, so that we can catch up with the advanced economies.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time for this discussion, and well, I've been dealing with this for the whole of my career, so an hour is certainly not enough to solve this. But I think the opportunities have been identified. Some really interesting comments about the need for scale, and I think how to aggregate up to that scale opportunity. Issues around land and bulk infrastructure, the financing. I think we've covered the breadth of it. I'm sure all of us here would welcome further conversation in person here or by email. This is something we all need to work on together. But the opportunity, I think we're all convinced, is there. We just have to crack how to do it. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much to each of our panelists for joining us on stage and, of course, participating in quite an invigorating conversation. I think you summed it up quite nicely, Kezia. Lots of opportunities that we need to unpack, and, of course, an hour is certainly not enough, but that just goes on to show just how much more we need to unpack in future conversations. Ladies and gentlemen, we move on to another presentation and panel discussion, and, of course, call for your participation in these conversations once more. This time, it's all about capital and the shifting dynamics that we do see with regard to African pension funds as well as sovereign fund capital moving away from stock markets to real estate investment opportunities. This is quite a big conversation which has certainly been on the cards for some time, and we look to explore this even further. We'll start off with a presentation as well by Malcolm Fair, who's the Managing Director of Rescura Solutions here in South Africa. That will be a 10 to 15-minute discussion, thereafter followed by a panel discussion between 40 and 45 minutes, which takes us to 11 o'clock promptly as we break up for our tea break. Allow me to welcome on stage Malcolm Fair, Managing Director of Rescura Solutions, as well as his panelists who will be joining him on stage for this conversation. Alicia Nguna, Chief Executive Officer for Construction Industry Pension Fund in Zimbabwe, followed by Tato Norman, Investments Manager at Debswana Pension Fund in Botswana, Muchindi Kasangola, Managing Director at Madison Asset Management in Zambia, Peter Rotich, Pensions Administration at Telposta Pension Scheme in Kenya, and Simon Nyakundi, Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya Railway Staff Retirement Benefit Scheme in Kenya. Please warmly welcome them on stage, ladies and gentlemen, and engage in the panel discussion and presentation.
Thank you. Seems we've got minimal time to get through what should be a very interesting topic with lots of different perspectives. The organizers asked me to just give an introductory presentation, which, given the time constraints, I'm going to flash through, and let's focus then on the panel discussion after that. So the piece I'm going to talk through is, I'm just going to give an introduction to this topic by giving you a sense of the size of the pensions industry in Africa, and then just talking to how pension funds go about investing in property and some of the challenges that they face. There have been in a number of the panels, including the previous one, a kind of a gauntlet thrown down to pension funds across the continent to invest into property. And I guess this is the panel you've all been waiting for, to figure out whether and find out how exactly you can attract capital from the pensions industry in the continent, if at all, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. Let me see if this thing turns on, off. Doesn't want to move my slides, so can I just ask someone to move the slides ahead? There we go. Thank you. All right, so how big is the pensions industry in Africa? You can see here, if you just run your eye down the countries on the left-hand side and then move across to the column marked AUM USD, so the amounts of assets in US dollars. And you can see quite quickly that the industry is dominated by South Africa, which has got 304 billion US dollars in it, followed by Nigeria. And then there's a slate of countries which have got a pensions industry of around about between $5 and $10 billion in them. Most of them contributory pension schemes, all of these contributory pension schemes. And you'll find in country a mixture of defined benefit and defined contribution. And the structures of the schemes differ from country to country, which our panelists will talk later. So the amounts of assets available for investment in property is set by that upfront. The growth of pension assets has been quite significant. You can see that on the left-hand side, and particularly also what's the size of the pensions industry versus the GDP, which are the blue dots measured on the right-hand side. So you can see in Southern Africa, South Africa, Namibia, high pensions industry versus GDP, but as you get further over to the right, the pensions industry is actually small by comparison to the size of the economies in those markets. And then one of the things is, of course, not the total AUM that you see in each country is available for investment into property, because there are restrictions on what you can invest. And this is an illustration of how much money is invested in the different asset classes across different jurisdictions in Africa. The focus particularly on the red, because that's fixed income. That's essentially, in most of these countries, the government debt, so government borrowings, which the pension funds are investing into. And you can see for a lot of countries, it's very large, driven perhaps mostly by the fact that yields of government bonds in some of those countries, take, for example, Nigeria, are extremely attractive. That makes other competing asset classes, makes it harder for other competing asset classes to get space in a pension portfolio. Nigeria, for example, the government's bonds are at about between 12 and 14%. Try and find a property to yield that much in country is tough. So the scope for real estate is not as much, and the orange perhaps reflects, it's called other asset classes here, but the orange does reflect to some extent the real estate availability within country, and you can see it's quite small. How do pension funds think about property? Well, they do need to weigh it up against other asset classes, and you can see here just a risk-return scatter of, so the risk measured by volatility and potential real returns, so over inflation of all the different asset classes. One should be weighing up property, you can see in mauve there, and this is a South African example, against the other asset classes available, and then figuring out in terms of an asset allocation that you're going to put together for your pensioners, how much property you should have. And that does depend on the potential for real return from the asset class, and obviously its real risk. In most cases, you find property lies somewhere between equity and fixed income, particularly if you're investing in real property, in rental properties, which is an ideal asset for a pension fund because you're going to have rentals increasing by inflation. And just made an illustrative example here. Let's say you renegotiate rentals every 5 years, you're going to get this cash flow stream coming out of that asset, which is ideal for a pension fund because pensioners and those saving towards receiving a pension receive pensions which increase on an annual rate, at an annual rate of inflation. So the ideal liability match for those pension payments out is some kind of cash flow stream that increases with inflation, and perhaps rental increases are a good proxy for that. So it's an excellent asset for pension funds, and that was pointed out in the previous session, but perhaps the dynamics of linking the pension funds to the actual properties is tough. Just lifted this from the Knight Frank research, showing the yields of property, rental yields of properties in major cities around the continent. What was most stark for me is that the range of rentals is only from 6 to 14%. Now, if you take some of the countries where, for example, interest rates are at beyond 20%, or perhaps inflation is in double digits as well, these kinds of yields for some pensions industries just aren't going to cut it. It's not an easy thing in getting pension funds to invest into property. These are some of the jurisdictions around Africa. The regulatory framework places restrictions on how much you can put into pensions. You can just see there in the percentages on the right-hand side. Actually, the restrictions are not low. These are quite significant percentages that you can put into property. But in a lot of jurisdictions, the supply of opportunities, and this is going to sound crazy because we've been talking all conference about how do we get capital into these projects, but supply of opportunities doesn't exist. Given that as well, and I showed you earlier the total assets under management of pension funds on the continent, I just drew this very basic table here of if you were approaching, so you're a property, you're in the property business and you're looking for capital, if you're approaching a pension fund, conceivably how much money could you actually raise from that pension fund? So if you convert your pension fund size into dollars on the left-hand side, and then you said, what's the dollar equivalent of 1% of the assets of that fund in the middle column, and Or alternatively, if you want to look at the other way around, is if I'm needing $10 million from a pension fund, what percentage of that fund am I going to be asking for? I can very quickly see, if you've got a single project and you're trying to approach a pension fund, that essentially it's unlikely that any pension fund is going to put more than, say, 5% of assets into any single project. In fact, most of the regulations in country will restrict you from putting 5%, more than 5% into a single project. In which case, you can only really deal with pension funds which are of 200 million or larger, $200 million or larger, which is a big ticket size in Africa, given what I showed you earlier, the size of assets under management and pension funds on the continent. What that therefore means for those of you out there that are running single projects is that you have to find some kind of aggregator of projects in order to approach the pension funds. So you need to find a middleman, be it an asset manager, find a listed entity, land yourself inside a REIT. You've got to find some kind of vehicle which allows the pension fund to diversify its portfolio of property assets and take exposure to, say, your single project in that means. It's a complex system of actually accessing the pension funds. People think it's easy. I know someone a trustee on the board. I'll go and talk to them and I'll get my project funded. Doesn't work that way. This is illustrative, but there are many different players involved in the whole investment program of a pension fund. And there are lots of different parties that ultimately you need to go and lobby and talk to in order to get your particular project or your product funded. And then lastly, just a little bit on property versus equity, the size of the different stock markets around the continent there. The number of listed companies on the left-hand axis, you can see South Africa dominates. A lot of the smaller economies have very few listed assets. Although what we are seeing is that there are more and more property entities coming to the listed markets to find capital, and that's encouraging because it's an easier asset for pension funds to invest into, particularly as a diversified portfolio of assets they're buying off the stock exchange. Turnover is unfortunately low, and that is an issue. But there are cases of placement of stock with pension funds that's possible. And in terms of the property asset class versus equity, certainly they are different in characteristic, even if the properties are listed, and that provides for nice diversification for the funds. Free float versus market cap. Typically, market caps are bigger than free floats, and that just gives an illustration of the problems with liquidity in the industry. Turnover is low outside of the major markets on the continent. Finally, representation of the stock markets compared with the GDP inside these different markets, and we've just taken 3 of the biggest markets outside of South Africa. The representation of the stock market is radically different to what the sectors of the economy actually present. So accessing the full range of industries in a country via the stock market is often not that easy. Most of the shares, and the majority you see here on listed shares, are in the financial services sector. Potentially that includes the property shares. It would probably include the property shares in most places. So for this discussion, clearly there is opportunity on the listed markets, but liquidity and size of the potential investment are still issues that the pension funds will face. All right, that's a whirlwind tour of Africa, the Africa pensions industry, and investing in property. Let's turn now to the different countries, and I'm going to engage with my panelists. I think everyone has been introduced, but if we can just focus again on the different countries here. So Elisha is from Zimbabwe. Peter and his colleague Simon on the end there are both from Kenya. Tato in the middle is from Botswana, and Muchindu is from Zambia. So we've got a nice suite of 4 different countries here being represented, and we're going to drill into those countries now and talk to some of the anecdotes and find out what are the limitations and restrictions and difficulties and opportunities for the property investment.
Okay, that is working. All right. Let me switch over to this one and just start with Elisha. Elisha, can you give us a little bit of color on the Zimbabwean industry, the property industry, the size thereof, and also talk a little bit about your fund and how you've invested into property in your fund?
Thank you very much. Good morning, delegates. I'm from Zimbabwe, and the pensions industry in Zimbabwe is worth about $3.35 billion, out of which close to 1.6 billion of those assets is in real estate. And from my fund's point of view, it's a $30 million fund, of which 17.5 of those assets is in real estate. The real estate is composed of your high-rise buildings, which will composed of retail and also office. Then you've got industrial units as well in 3 cities, that is Mutare, Bulawayo, and Harare. We also currently have a project in a shopping mall in a dormitory town called Norton, where we intend to put a mixed mall where we have an anchor tenant as a supermarket. Then we have a food court and a variety of small shops, and including banking halls. As a fund, we also recently developed a housing scheme in Stone Ridge, where we harvested about 868 housing stands, and in that we reserved 40% for our membership and 60% for the open market. We were fortunate enough to have a collaboration in terms of development of the houses with a building society, to which as a fund we have had a back-to-back facility for our members to access mortgages at a 0% deposit. And the fund in turn would make a fixed income investment as a facility to securitize the mortgages. And in that respect, we feel that that's going to be the thrust for the fund going forward, where we intend to do more housing schemes in other areas outside of Harare for the benefit of our members and also the economy at large.
Thanks, Elisha. Peter?
From a Kenyan perspective, pension funds are worth 10 billion US dollars in Kenyan shillings. That's approximately Kenyan shillings 1 trillion. From a regulatory perspective, pension schemes are allowed to invest up to 30% of their assets in properties. We have a scenario at the moment, I think over the last three years, where the appetite for investments in property has been growing. From my pension scheme perspective, we are at the stage where we are exiting at the moment property because we have reached a maximum. We have actually exceeded the regulatory requirements. The partnership between the private developers and the pension scheme exists in our country. In fact, it is driven by the demand by members for housing development. That appetite, if you are interested in investing in Kenya, you are most welcome. What essentially has to happen as investors is which sector? The high end is saturated. The demand for housing in the low end sector. Demand in Kenya is around 500,000 houses per year. How many are we churning into the housing sector, less than 20,000 per year. So that appetite is there. The regulator has put in place mechanisms which enables private sector participation to enable pension schemes release their funds to enable developers get these funds and invest. As developers also, when they come into the pension schemes, because the age profiles of each pension scheme differs, the private sector person has to be extremely careful in terms of the risk appetite. Is it a young scheme? Is it a mature scheme? My example, in my pension scheme is a mature scheme. We are a bit very conservative, so that's why we are at the exit. For young pension schemes, where the members, the age profile is very, very young, the appetite is great because you're looking at the life aspect of the member. They are able actually to take in that risk, engage their funds, put it into the market with private developers, and get good yields. Thank you.
Tato, a little bit about Botswana.
In Botswana, our pension fund for the Botswana Pension Fund is about 6.8 billion pula. That equates to about 7.6 billion rands. We do have a strategic asset allocation to property. We like property because it provides an inflation hedge. It really tends to have an income stream which one can plan on. In Botswana, for instance, the yield on property is about 22.5%. The yield on retail property is about 16%. So retail property has done particularly well in Botswana. What has really struggled has been industrial property and also household property. In terms of industrial property, the government does try to subsidize industries, and therefore it has supported rentals for industrial sector companies to foster development in the industrial sector. The household sector has struggled due to low household confidence, due to higher levels of unemployment, and just due to low business confidence. For me as an investor, when I compare what I get, the yield I can earn on retail property, it's much higher than the yield I can earn on a fixed income instrument. Just to put things into perspective, if you were to buy a 10-year yielding bond in Botswana, you'd earn a yield of about 6%. If you were to buy a mall in Botswana, which is situated in an ideal node or location, you would earn a yield of about 20%. So property in Botswana has value, and hence that's why the fund is invested in property. The only challenge is there's a lot of money, real money, chasing fewer trophy assets, and that just leads to a concern on valuations. Thank you.
Muchinda, a bit about Zambia.
Thank you. Yeah, well, from the Zambian perspective, we have total assets under management and pensions sitting about $3 billion, of which about 40% of that is sitting with the National Social Security Fund. A large part of the emphasis of pension funds is on the property side, where we have regulatory allocations to the extent of about 35%. So that's the threshold. We've seen that property has become increasingly an asset class of choice as it provides very stable cash flows over a long period of time. And when you compare it with equities, for instance, it gives you less volatility. And for pension funds, particularly those that are very risk averse, it provides a very good alternative for stable long-term cash flows. But one of the things that we have seen in terms of challenges for pension funds to invest in real estate has been the aspect of development risk. So you see a lot of pension funds are averse to taking up development risk because A, they do not have the competencies to actually identify and execute projects, and secondly, they do not want to incur the opportunity cost during the development period. So that provides a very significant opportunity for developers to come in to fill in that space. So pension funds are quite happy to take on existing properties with certain cash flows, and so then ride with the rental yields thereof. What we've also seen is from the regulatory framework, there are options for either standalone funds or umbrella funds that are affiliated to one
You're talking
scheme.
about the pension funds there,
Yes,
not the property funds. Yeah.
Correct. So,
Yeah.
so there is the option of having to sit in a pool or sit as a segregated fund. So from the segregated funds perspective, you find there's a lot of fragmentation. And most of these funds would average anything from $100,000, $200,000 to $1 million. But they have the obligation to allocate a certain amount of their portfolio to real estate. But because of their size, that presents a challenge for them to invest in traditional brick and mortar. And that's presented an opportunity again for property funds and REITs to package portfolios of real estate with certain cash flows, which are then unitized to allow these smaller pension funds to participate and get the necessary allocation.
Thank you. Simon, we've heard a bit about Kenya, but love to hear about the railways scheme, and perhaps as the chairman, I believe, of the Pensions Association in Kenya, you might be able to say a little bit about some of your colleagues in the area around Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, possible.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, participants. Yes, you've heard from Rotich that in Kenya we started the reforms back in 1999, and in 1999 when we enacted the RBA Act, which brought sanity within the pension sector. Traditionally, pension schemes in Kenya would only invest in the traditional assets, that is equity and bonds. But the asset classes were reviewed and improved, and therefore some of the schemes would now invest in property, 30% of their asset under management in property. Those reforms within then the East African followed suit. Uganda is following us very closely, and they've passed their act, I think around 2-3 years ago. We also have Rwanda following through very closely, and therefore you would find across East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, in that order, and Rwanda. Tanzania has a different framework in terms of their management of pension schemes, and therefore is slightly different. The new kid in the block is Southern Sudan, and they are having their act in order. So if all those, and Burundi, so to speak, so if all those get their act together, we believe that they will follow, because of the East African community, they will follow through on what Kenya has done, because they have the protocol and the agreement within the East African community. Back to Kenya, we've seen pension schemes investing directly, and Peter said about the 30% maximum, but the RBA, if you are beyond 30%, what happens? You go back to the regulator and you come up with a remedial plan on how you are going to do, because throwing all properties into the market will probably kill the market or bring down the values. And because we are managing members' funds, we have to do it in a methodological way. Back to the developments that are also happening currently, we have seen the Act reviewed, and therefore we've seen rates come in as an asset class, and that those rates then you have to access either development or investment, and those you will see probably some of our pension schemes probably listing in those. Therefore, there are 3 ways that schemes get into property: that's direct purchase, or development rates, or investment. Back to my previous assignment, I think I did it back in 2005, where we did a public-private partnerships. The legislation had not been clear on that, so we ended up getting private partners. What we did in my scheme then, we had land, and we had plenty of land, but we didn't have money to develop because, like Roticha said, we were beyond the limit. And what we did is we looked for partners, and when we brought in the partners, they came in with money and the expertise, and we looked at designs of houses that would probably float in the market and probably will go away. They were purely for commercial use, and I've had my colleagues talk about members would push to get, but they will come in just commercially and no preferential price. And that did very well, and most of the schemes thereafter followed suit. And most of the schemes now in Kenya are either coming out of a deficit. A deficit is where if you look at your assets and liabilities, you have more liabilities than assets. So that means most of the schemes following suit in the properties would be able to fill up the gap in their deficit. That has propelled Kenya in terms of property development, and most schemes have appetite for property. It drove the prices of property high, and I think from the previous speakers you've seen most of the new things that are coming into the market. So there's a lot of appetite of property in Kenya, both within urban and probably not so far from the urban areas to open up new areas in major towns. So across the country, wherever the small towns, you will find the property prices have gone up. What has the government done to enable this to be fueled and to move on forward? Tax incentives have been given. Schemes are tax exempt, and when they brought in new products, then the government comes in with the tax incentives. They are trying now to automate the land registry, which was a bottleneck in terms of getting clearances and getting things done in Kenya, which will then enable. The other thing is the titling. Some of the problems we had of ownership are being sorted, and once that has happened, now you get a title and you just do a scan and you will check whether it's genuine or not. So it is to clear the how do I put it, not so honest people out of the way. So that's what we are doing, and we are going to see a lot more. Currently, as at this week, the RBS through the World Bank has given a consultant to be able to review the asset classes. The trustees who are like the board of directors who manage schemes have all been, there's a legislation that all of them have to be trained so that we are at par, and such forums like this are what they need to attend. Once they do understand then their role, they will be able to execute their mandate. So that is happening in Kenya as well, and we will see a lot more happening, especially with the review of the asset classes. We are saying that it is limiting because the asset classes prescribe how we need to invest, but what we are saying is we know the knowledge on how to invest. Let the trustees be given a free will, and that's probably what we'll be pushing for.
Thank you, Simon. So to my panelists, let's try and give the audience here a sense of the case for property in country. We've heard some of it, but starting with you, Elisha, Zimbabwe is a fascinating place from a pensions point of view because, of course, through hyperinflation and dollarization, the majority of pension assets were effectively wiped out for pensioners. Property presented, I presume, an opportunity for a real asset. And yet, yesterday we heard the story of the White Elephant property in downtown Harare. So, as a fund in country, given the economic and political circumstances, what are you and perhaps some of your colleagues, what's driving you to still invest in property?
Okay, thank you.
It's working, I think. Yeah, it is working. It is. Yeah. Just try.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Surely, after the hyperinflation, the only assets that retained value were your properties. And as you may be aware, the only way to protect pensioners' money is to have assets that can preserve in terms of value and also be earning some income. And most of the qualification of tenants or getting of tenants into properties, the thrust prior to the current dispensation was you would get your single tenant on a building, or maybe per level, each level of a building, a tenant. However, with the movement of the economy from being more formal to informal, you then realize that more of your big corporates have shut down because of the economic meltdown. Then it leaves pension funds with assets that are not occupied. So most of the funds and some of the insurance companies that do hold property have now relaxed the way they attract tenants to the extent that the amount of space that's occupied is now, you can get somebody, an informal trader, or you can't call them informal to the extent that they are incorporated. They would get 10 square meters, and in a floor of, say, 400 square meters, you would get between 10 to 20 small holder tenants. And those, like in our case, it has improved our occupants rate from about 54% in 2012 to current rates of about 76%. And that has improved the rental collections that we have. And your default rate for your small scale tenants is very small as opposed to your corporates who would be occupying your 600 square meters, because their cash flows are compromised and they can be in a position to meet your rental or the rental obligations. So there is a shift from acquiring your big corporate single tenanted buildings to having your small scale tenants. And more so, we are also looking at changing the scopes of some of these buildings from, you may know that most of your young professionals do not have accommodation. I think the earlier presentation showed that there's been a lot of urbanization, but there hasn't been any increase in housing stock. And your young professionals would need your single bedroomed accommodation, and it's nowhere to be found. So we are now looking, and we have applied to the municipalities to change the scope or the uses of these buildings to ensure that you have your multiple use on a building. You can have your offices, maybe your first level, third up to the fourth. Then from the fifth up to the 16th, you can have accommodation. So that will improve the collections in terms of income on properties. Properties will continue as pension funds to invest in them, because we know that there is a fallback in terms of value and also a guaranteed return if fully occupied.
Thanks. Thanks, Elisha. Elisha, it's fair to say that in Zimbabwe, most of the funds do their own property management using their internal management teams. Is that true?
Yes.
So you don't see a lot of intermediaries in the property market.
They are there. I think what happened was during the hyperinflationary era, as you may be aware that your intermediaries would normally pay once per month. Right. Normally in Zim it's after the 7th. Right. So when you are in an inflationary environment, you would want to have your resources ASAP and apply them, whether to invest or and so on. So whenever the rentals were then remitted, they would be valueless. So most of the funds then internalize the management of the property portfolios in order to manage the cash flows and invest in time.
Peter, in Kenya, also, what's the spread of funds investing by themselves or going via intermediaries in the industry, and what's the case for either?
Thank you. In Kenya, for the large pension schemes, they've actually outsourced their services. On property management, large pension schemes actually realize the need in terms of professionalism to hire a property consulting firm. They come in with an engineer, an architect, quantity surveyor, and you pay them. It becomes a challenge for smaller pension schemes because of costs implications. So what happens for smaller pension schemes? They have an umbrella function where they don't have the capacity, they outsource. Bigger schemes, you outsource. At the same time, internally, you have a manager, a property officer, qualified, registered, who liaises with this professional consulting firm because you can afford it. We have it in my institution where a property officer sits and liaises and reports to the board.
Okay. Thanks. Tatso, you mentioned earlier, you spoke a little bit to the case for investing, a very compelling case for investing in Botswana. Yields on government bonds are low, and you can get attractive yields in particularly retail you talked about. What is the landscape of investing in property? What sort of avenues has one got for investing into property in Botswana? Are there intermediaries involved? Are you investing directly yourselves? And what do other pension funds inside Botswana, speaking outside the Botswana Pension Fund, how do they go about investing in property?
With the Botswana Pension Fund, we've insourced the investments of properties. And this is just due to the fact that, one, we are comparatively small on an economies of scale basis. And secondly, there are so many few assets in Botswana. I think the capital city has about maybe 5 or 6 major malls. So if you were to find a property give a mandate to property in an illiquid environment, you wouldn't perhaps manage your portfolio as efficiently as if you did it internally. What I've seen though is with the larger pension funds, i.e. The Public Officers Pension Fund, which has assets under management of close to 68 billion, they've outsourced. The economies of scale allow for that. I think one other interesting dynamic about Botswana is in our landscape, we are allowed to invest up to 70% of our assets offshore, which means that we invested in the US, we invested in Europe, we invested in emerging market economies.
And that's very unusual compared to other economies in Africa, and other pensions industries in Africa. Yes,
it's quite unusual, but it has benefited the fund in the sense that we know that equity prices have rallied owing to the fact that central banks did embark on quantitative easing to support the economies. So we've had the Dow Jones, the S&P 500 rally. Now we're at a point where we're saying, look, we've heard our returns, let's realize those earnings. Let's perhaps look more insular. Let's look at Botswana. Let's look at the retail space. Let's look at what it can offer us going forward. Thank you.
Okay, great. Mchendu, a little bit about Zambia. Madison is an asset management company. You were saying last night that you have a property capability. Perhaps a little bit about that and how that filters into the pension funds ultimately.
Indeed. So, well, what we see in our jurisdiction is the drive to lower the cost of operating pension funds. And so most of the management services...
Can you put the mic a bit closer?
Most of the management services are incorporated in the asset management contract. So you find most of the typical services that would be outsourced will sit within the asset management companies. So your property management and
so the funds themselves are not managing the assets. It's not an in-source.
So that's outsourced to the asset manager. But one of the things that also the asset manager will be doing is assisting the pension funds to identify the right opportunities. Much as you have the allocation to invest within real estate, there are several considerations. I think over the last 24 hours, we've had a lot of discussions around oversupply. And that's not unique to South Africa and the rest of the region. It's typical of Zambia as well, especially when you look at where we're coming from. We obviously had an election in 2016, and so because of that perceived high political risk, there was a bit of aversion and a bit of a slowdown. And coupled with that, being a mono economy, predominantly dependent on copper mining as a mainstay of the economy, we also suffered some external shocks with copper prices trading around the $4,000 per ton range. And so that basically cut down the growth focus from the average of 7-8% that we're accustomed to the last 5-10 years to about 3%.
In property?
No, that's general economic growth.
Sorry, yes.
And obviously we saw that filter through the real estate asset class. And because of the capital nature of real estate projects, we saw a bit of a lag in terms of the sector responding to reduce on ongoing projects to respond to the changing economic dynamics. So we're currently sitting on a huge oversupply, but fundamentals have since begun to shift, and we've seen copper prices trading around $6,200, $6,300 per ton. We've seen a lot of that political risk come off. We've also seen domestic interest rates begin to normalize and inflation sitting in single digit. So we do expect that then the demand will begin to catch up and will provide a compelling reason for pension funds to continue to invest in the real estate asset class.
Just putting you on the spot, in your balanced, let's say you have a balanced product for a smaller pension funds to invest into, what percentage would you put into property typically?
Yeah, well, we put anything between 20 and 25%.
Okay,
of course,
so
the threshold is 35%, but we try to trade cautiously and also look at the prevailing risks that are associated with that asset class within that particular period.
Right. And then just a last quick word on NAPSA, obviously dominates the pensions industry. You mentioned that earlier. Are they doing property investment directly, or are they outsourcing as well?
Yeah, so the National Pension Scheme Authority, which is the largest public pension fund and dominates the industry, like you've said, has this in-house management team. So they embark on property investments directly. As an industry, there's been concerns about the levels of efficiency with that structure. And so there's been a lot of lobby around National Pension Scheme Authority opening up the fund to private specialist managers. We've seen a bit of reform in that direction, though not conclusive. But there are indications that the fund could be opened up in the near future, talking of a year, 2 years down the line. And that will allow for greater accountability and a lot more efficiency in terms of how projects are deployed and in terms of how yield is then pursued for the benefit of the members.
Thank you. Simon, a little bit about Kenya. I'm interested in again, the disintermediation. Are funds doing the property investment themselves, or are they using asset managers or investing on the stock exchange to gain access?
It's a mix from different scheme to scheme. Like Peter said, most schemes that are smaller in nature would use the services of a fund manager and property managers, but others would probably have the internal resources. And I'm talking about pension schemes that are bigger or parastatal based, that have a sponsor who have a team that is able to help the scheme then realize their goal. So mostly they will do a mix depending on from scheme to scheme, and sometimes even hire consultants if the skill set that they require internally is not available. They would probably go out in the market and get somebody who has the skill to help the trustees to realize that vision.
Just on the challenges, we were talking last night over dinner about the DB schemes and their funding levels and the challenges that the property investments bring to the market. Maybe I think that's a nice anecdote to share with the audience.
Like we said, most of the DB schemes did have a deficit, and the government was very clear that because that's a liability that passes back to the government, and therefore the government really needed to help some of these schemes to be able to realign themselves. And some of the properties that they had would be of challenge to them, like I said earlier. And therefore, a bit of reforms were being done, especially to DB schemes. They had to close, and some of them converted to defined contribution schemes. Even at that point, some of the assets that they were holding, they had to probably offload, and that's why you heard from my end, my scheme and Rotich scheme, which are mature schemes that preceded independence, had to start selling. And we clearly did a strategic plan even for our schemes, and most of the schemes have done so, together with the investment management agreements that we have, investment policy statements that we have, to systematically offload them into the market. However, there are challenges into the market because not all the market can take it, and therefore we have to do some developments that will be able to sell, either design and build, then sell to the general public, or do public-private partnerships. And that has helped most of these schemes now. The schemes are fully funded, and they are looking at even doing greater and bigger things. And we invest in property not only because of the income or the valuations. We invest in property because of our markets are not deep enough. If you look at Johannesburg Stock Exchange, can't compare to Nairobi Stock Exchange. So we really have to look at alternative assets, and the alternative assets would probably be property. So especially from what we've gone through previously, the stock markets were not doing very well. The interest rates were not so good. So we had to look at what are the alternatives out there in the market, and that's why the rates came in and property investment have boomed. And most of the properties in Kenya have more than tripled or doubled, grown 10 times, and that has also propelled schemes to do very well, and that has also encouraged other schemes that do not have their a portfolio of property in their portfolio to probably start looking at where they are going to do. We've started seeing land banking, where you just buy for speculation and hold to be able to sell.
We've just been told we're running out of time. Just before we turn to questions, I'm just going to ask my panelists, since one of the themes we were covering here is equity or property. Just want to run through, pose you a question, put you on the spot. You've got 5% of your fund has just opened up in liquidity. You've got a 5-year horizon. Would you put it into equities in your country or into property in your country? Okay, so you've just landed on a windfall of cash. 5% of your fund. Elisha?
I would go in property housing. The IRR for housing, like the project that we did, where we were looking at 33%. So there is a guarantee that that stock can move, and I would leave the equities.
Peter?
Yes, I would still go into properties, though private equity is a new venture. It's just come into the market, but as part of also social responsibility, I would encourage developers to partner with pension schemes and enter into property.
It's an excellent point you made about social responsibility. Of course, that's a huge advantage of a lot of property projects, and is a big selling point to trustees of pension schemes for the development of property opportunities. Tato?
I'd go into property, just owing to the fact that we remain underweight our target. So that windfall would definitely go to property. And again, you want a diversified portfolio. You want asset classes with lower correlations, and property has a lower correlation to both equities and bonds. Thank you.
Thank you. Muchindu, Zambia.
Yeah, well, I'll say real estate as well.
Okay.
and with a particular focus on industrial real estate, warehousing particularly, for the simple reason that Zambia is obviously moving towards trying to diversify the economy through value addition via manufacturing. It's also trying to position itself as a regional hub, so obviously logistics becomes very key in that respect. And so warehousing is one of the sub-asset classes that I'll probably allocate to.
Very interesting. Simon?
I will go to property, low-cost housing, or a mall.
Okay. Well, there you have it, folks, from the panel. All 5 of the panelists saying given 5% of asset size in their portfolios, they'd be putting it into property. I guess that's a pretty good outcome for the audience looking to raise capital from pension funds. And with that, can we turn to questions on the floor? I see a question.
Thank you. My name is Natasha. I'm a real estate lawyer from Zambia. And my question to the panelists is, you've all spoken about investing in property either directly or through an intermediary. And I would like to find out whether you're investing in affordable mechanisms for your constituents to actually purchase housing. Because I think if we tie into the first presentation this morning, we've seen that affordability still remains a key factor. So I'd be really interested to find out whether you're looking at investing in vehicles and mechanisms that can facilitate your members actually being able to afford the investments that you're making in real estate. Thank you.
Elisha, perhaps you want to take that?
Yep. Thank you very much. I think I indicated that the scheme that we did in Harare, the Stone Ridge housing scheme, where we reserved 40% of the stands, the 868, which is about 340 for our members. We then went ahead to have a collaboration with a building society, which is going to put up the housing units, and our members are not going to pay a deposit, but they will just be paying their monthly mortgage repayments for 20 to 25 years, depending on the age. And the fund has done a back-to-back facility on the fixed income side with the building society in order to be the security for those mortgages.
Just to supplement a little bit there, during our conversation last night over dinner, Elisha was telling us that following the dollarization and hyperinflation, and since most people lost all their assets in the pension savings scheme, there was a kind of a revolution in Zimbabwe from members of pension funds to say, actually, we'd prefer to have a house that's being funded for us during the life of contributing to the scheme than we would having cash being saved up in an account waiting for us to be able to buy the house during the end of a term. And I guess that's part of the motivation that's led Elisha and his scheme to look at housing opportunities in Zimbabwe. Any other questions? I think we probably have time for one more question.
Yeah, I've got a question here. I'm completely at the back, to your left. I'm Francois Verily from the University of Cape Town. The point that you just made about hyperinflation, lack of confidence in pension funds, has happened throughout the globe. After 2008, I think the general trust that investors have in pension funds, banking system, and so forth has diminished considerably. Much of your discussion this afternoon, or this morning, has been about intermediaries, about liquidity, and so forth. The question I'd like to pose to your panelists is, not to be too harsh, but do you think there's a future for your business and your pension funds and the products that you are offering in a world of blockchain, Bitcoin, where you as an intermediary between the investor and the property sector diminishes? Take the Kenyan example. I don't see why we can't move the M-Pesa system, which at the moment is a money flow, into an ability for investors to invest directly in real estate through M-Pesa, cutting out the intermediates in between. So just to, and also on the crowdfunding, we say that our markets don't have depth. They don't have depth because of the systems that we have in place. There is funding around. There is money in these economies, but maybe they will end up in the property sector through crowdfunding and other means than necessarily relying on pension funds to make the property market happen. Thank you very much.
Let me answer the first question regarding the 2008 market performance. I think it went up to 2011. In our country, funnily enough, as the stocks actually went down, what came to protect the pension schemes were those pension schemes which had higher holdings in property. The property is appreciated. That was the uniqueness in Kenya. Number two, with regard to the new technology, pension schemes by nature are very conservative. Trustees also are very conservative. By the time even we are partnering with private developers with a view to developing properties, it takes a while. It's you know, unlike other investments. Let me give an example. For private developers, you would behave like there's this animal in Africa that jumps. In our place, we call it dick. I don't know what you call it in South Africa, springboks?
Yeah, dick. We also have dick.
Yeah, so I think private developers are like that. They want to invest immediately. If the time taken is long, they exit. But you have to be patient with pension schemes, with trustees. New innovations like the Bitcoin, the M-Pesa, trustees would have to be very conservative. By the time they are getting into that investment, they would really have to have been convinced. Thank you.
Machinda.
Yeah, perhaps just to add on to what has been said regarding the last question. I think in order to try and reinforce that trust aspect, there's need for intermediaries such as asset managers in collaboration with regulators to see how we can make pension funds work more for the members. It appears in most jurisdictions in sub-Saharan Africa, we operating on guidelines that ideally are suited for more mature setups. And we're sitting here talking about housing deficits and so many bottlenecks in terms of a value chain to try and unlock this potential. But then we're also sitting on a considerable amount of funds that are available to be able to achieve some of these objectives. So I think there's need to begin to challenge the status quo, to see our guidelines really relevant for the purposes that we're trying to achieve and the objectives we're trying to achieve. And as Natasha from Zambia also mentioned, what can we do to facilitate, for instance, ownership of homes for our members of the respective pension funds that we represent. So I think that's a challenge that we all need to go back with and begin to challenge these assumptions. Thank you.
Elisha, you look like you've got something to add.
Yes, I just wanted to add that pension arrangements, as it were, they're more like your long-term savings. And even if there is this technological advancements that's coming in, all that's needed is for the trustees and administrators to ride on to the technological advancement and sell the same products to the members. And in most cases, why governments and regulators would advocate that pension funds continue, it's more of a forced saving and not, if you were to look at statistics, about 3% of every population would want to do savings on their own, and the remaining 7% would need to be railroaded. So pension funds or such schemes would then cover for their needs when they need the most, which is in retirement.
Yeah, last comment from me on that one is in pensions regulation globally, clearly they are looking at technological advances, and certainly blockchain technology would be very useful from a security point of view for individuals' assets. But back to the structures, the pensions design is looked at in the broader framework of social security within a country, and you have the baseline of social security safety net that the country may or may not feel obligated to provide. You then have a national compulsory contributory pension schemes, which sits as a layer above that. And then you have another layer above that, which is voluntary pension contributions over and above what's compulsory. And certainly in the voluntary space, where it's kind of seen by the government as additional extra money that people can save, there's huge scope for those things at this point. And I'm sure that those regulators that are ahead of the game would be thinking to try and bring that kind of technology in that space and allow for the individual to express their own will for saving for retirement, particularly if there are tax benefits to doing it. So I do think there's scope for it, but at the baseline, government still feels a certain obligation to be providing some sort of social security net, some governments anyway, and have the finances to do that. And they also don't want the situation where, for example, somebody makes their own choice to invest in Bitcoin, and Bitcoin crashes, they lose their retirement money, and they come back to the government and say, please help. So there will always, I think, be that compulsory portion that the governments are going to insist on. So with that, I'd like to thank the panelists very much for the contribution. I think it's been a good session. We've certainly learned a lot about the 4 countries here, and it seems to me we've also got an answer for all of you in the audience, is that there's a lot of demand and for property investment. In the housing space, the retail area, so right across different sectors depending on countries. And that's something which I guess all of us have to think through, is what is the nature of each country, and what are the specific demands of the savings pools in those countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you once more to our panelists for joining us in conversation. Again, much appreciated, and I do understand that you are available throughout the conference for further interaction with some of our participants. Thank you very much. Once more, a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, as they make their way off stage. Indeed, it is time for us to have our tea break. Please do bear in mind that the 2 sub-conferences will commence at 11:30 promptly in the blue as well as the green room. So please allocate yourself according to the conversations that you'd like to participate in. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of today's conference, we won't be reconvening here in the main plenary, but do bear in mind that we will have cocktails at the Sand Deck at the Sandton Sun. That will start at about 4:15 or 4:15. And of course, our cocktail session will be proudly sponsored by Profika. Just before that, though, as we do make our way to our tea break, once again, we'd like to thank our sponsors, our speakers, as well as delegates for making their time with us here today. Platinum sponsor, Brow Property Group. Gold sponsors, APSA under Barclays, Grit Real Estate Income Fund. And of course, not forgetting our silver sponsors, Cushman Wakefield Accelerate, Standard Bank, ECIC, and Crystal Lagoons. The sub-conferences commence promptly at 11:30, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you once more for your time.
She home,